Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom. Today we are doing a book review. The fine folks at Casemate had sent me a couple review copies in the mail last week, both of which copies of books from their Casemate Illustrated series. These are the first ones of this particular series I've had a chance to look at. I posted the first review a couple days ago. That was the one on Allied armor in Normandy. This other one that we're looking at today is on the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Both of these books are by Yves Buffetaut, Buffetaut. Obviously, I don't trust my pronunciation of French names. And he wrote the other one that I reviewed a couple days ago as well. So, as far as just a quick description of the book, according to the cheat sheet they sent me here, it is 128 pages. Paperback, obviously, it's about 7 inches by 10, so fairly standard size format. It was published on April 5th of this year, so it's only been out for 3-4 months there, and retails in the U.S. for $24.95, in Great Britain for $19.99 pounds, of course. So this is. First off, just start with my impression, just the physical book itself. It seems like a well put together, an attractive book. Like I said, 120 pages. The binding seems pretty solid. It should hold together. I have some of the older softcover books that don't age well over the years, but this one seems pretty well put together. The pages are quite glossy, and really you can see the reproduction of the photos is very good, as are the color illustrations. And again, like I said, it's a heavily illustrated book, so that's good. Obviously, with a series that's called Illustrated, you want the pictures to look good. So definitely they succeed on that point. So it definitely has, it's just a little more of a substantial of a book than say like some of the thinner New Osprey series, without being being a little more expensive, but not that much more really when you look at it. As to the content. It's pretty straightforward. This is a history of 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. One of the better known and maybe more notorious of the German units during World War II. I almost said German army units. Obviously, it's not part of the German here or the Wehrmacht. This is an SS unit. So don't confuse it with the 2nd Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. This is the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Now, if you're watching my channel, I assume you're probably pretty familiar with all this stuff anyway, but just pointing that out. And it is strictly a military history of the unit. And by that I mean it really goes through sort of the history of how the unit evolved, because it didn't start off as a division. Most of these SS units didn't. They started off smaller and evolved throughout the war and the different campaigns it fought in. And it sticks pretty closely to that without addressing some of the larger issues. And I'll talk about that a little later. But let me just sort of flip through the book to give you an idea of what it looks like. So you can see here, like I said, heavily illustrated. So here, like, one picture taking up 2 whole pages. Like I said, it's a really nice reproduction, the photo quality. And the book's mostly done in these sort of single page, sort of like a large heading with a couple paragraphs. So these sort of little digestible bites of information, so to speak, or like, these sort of profiles of some of the more important and infamous characters associated with history of the unit. I mean, here we have Himmler. So sort of an outline of the beginning of the division's history, then going through some of the campaigns it fought in. Here's an example of sort of some of the color photos of, it goes through the history. Some of the vehicles, obviously. Being a Panzer division, people are going to be interested in the vehicles and the tanks. Here's some more pictures, and these are quite well done. I'm not sure if these have appeared in other books. It's possible. A lot of times these kind of illustrations get recycled book to book, but I have to say I didn't recognize very many of the photos, but I don't spend a ton of time looking at photos of SS units. It's just not a huge point of interest to me outside of looking specifically at ones of pictures of tanks. Anyhow, so as we go through, here's a little thing. One thing, like I will say, like I said, it's strictly a history, combat history, it does not go much into the larger context. The fact that this is an SS division, and what's the role of the SS in the war? What are they doing? Obviously, they're involved in a lot of really horrendous things, as we know. But also, there was a real effort at the end of the war, after the war, by people that were involved with it, including some of the former Second SS Panzer Division leaders, to kind of write the history of the unit in a way to sort of protect their own reputations and that of their men, and kind of whitewash what they were doing. And this book, it sort of alludes to that a little bit, but it doesn't really, like I say, address those larger issues. And sometimes it sort of promotes the kind of things that these guys were saying somewhat uncritically. So here in this little section on SS Viking, which was, a unit primarily made of non-German soldiers, and it just says, the superb performances of Viking Russia opened the floodgates to further units of this type, drawing on foreign nationals, until in Paul Hauser's view, Hauser was a former commander of the division, the Waffen-SS became Europe's finest international army. That notion of the Waffen-SS as this international army is one that sort of really, some of these guys tried to promote after the war, sort of justifying it, like, hey, it was just, all these people of Western Europe standing up against the communists or whatever, and that's been pretty thoroughly debunked. And interestingly enough, by Kenneth Estes, who, if you follow my channel, you would know, writes primarily about armor and tanks. But in this particular book, European Anabasis, he kind of takes apart that notion of the Western European volunteers in the German army and SS as a sort of, they were all just like guys motivated to defeat Bolshevism or something. Much more complicated, complex story, and he goes into that book. I just like to promote Ken's stuff, and since that one hasn't had anything to do with tanks, I haven't had a chance to give it a little shout out. But there you go. And like I said, that sort of unwillingness to address some of these larger issues of the nature of the SS and of the war get glossed over. So the author will talk about some of these figures and kind of say things like recriminations were made after the war, and sort of leave it at that. Without saying like, well, what were these people accused of? It's sort of important piece of information. And so sort of here, let's see, flip forward. So like here when we get to the Normandy campaign, there is one little paragraph here that mentions massacres. In the meantime, the invasion was prompted a widespread uprising of French resistance. Das Reich found itself in running fights with armed members of the Maquis. Several elements committed a series of war crimes, notably at Tulle and Ordor-sur-Glane. The latter pure reprisal against civilians. These tragedies were inexcusable. Certain that some troops adopted in France the same scorched earth conduct used in Russia, where massacring civilians and razing villages to the ground was commonplace. The German army itself, including Rommel, were horrified at the news of Ordor and demanded an investigation. However, the commander of the scene, Adolf Deichmann, was shortly after killed on the invasion front, along with much of the battalion, so the true inquiry only came after the war. So, those are two fairly well-known incidents. I mean, if you just go to the Wikipedia page for Das Reich, which is obviously has much less content than this book, but, it mentions those pretty prominently, and so they really get sort of underplayed here. And, you might say, well, what's that have to do with the military history of the unit? I mean, it's, we want to know about the battles and whatever. I'm like, well, the thing is, I don't think you can separate out the military history from these massacres and war crimes that took place. They're all part and parcel of the mission of the SS, which is to carry out Hitler's war plans, which were war crimes in and of themselves on the highest magnitude. And, that's why after the war, the SS is declared, the Waffen-SS included, is declared a criminal organization. So whereas the Wehrmacht was not, they said the Wehrmacht was at times involved in these crimes, but it was the national defense force of the German state, whereas the SS was just obviously an instrument of Hitler's criminal regime. So that's, like I said, one of my criticisms is kind of that, I don't want to say whitewashing, because he does acknowledge these things, but it's in a very passive way. Some of the things that these divisions, these German SS units were involved with. But one other thing that jumped out at me too that I thought was worth mentioning, because it's probably one of those things, particular fans of armored warfare history, have heard about. He makes mention of Ernst Bachmann. So here in the section on the Ardennes, he talks about Bachmann's heroics. The next day, Ernst Bachmann of Normandy Heroics again launched a one-man massacre of the Shermans. You know, fairly dramatic way of putting it. And for those not familiar, at a certain point, this idea of Ernst Bachmann in Normandy, where his Panther tank took on and destroyed 9 Shermans single-handedly while parked next to a big oak tree at a crossroads or some such story like that. And then later in the Ardennes, the problem is that people have looked into these stories, and I know particularly Steven Zaloga makes a note of it in Armored Champion, his book that came out 3 or 4 years ago, where he went through the records, or him and some other people, and there's no corroborating evidence for Bachmann's exploits. If you look in the Allied records, they just didn't have the losses that day that supposedly he inflicted upon these units. So it makes you wonder, maybe we should start looking more critically at these claims, because how do we know about Bachmann? Well, I would assume that during the war, the Germans are the ones promoting the story and putting medals on his chest. Well, in 1944, I'm not going to really trust anything that SS propaganda is putting out. I certainly wouldn't take it as the gospel truth, particularly without any corroborating evidence in the Allied archival records backing it up. So, like I say, there's this notion of German tank aces is just these stories stick around and are reported uncritically. And like I say, always take these things with a grain of salt. Ask, where is this information coming from? I mean, that's why scholarship exists. That's why it's always important to look at the sources, that any author you're reading are coming from, seeing if they're keeping up to date, with sort of the latest findings and interpretations. Because like I said, after World War II, there was a real effort on the part of a lot of these guys that were involved in these units, these SS units, that wrote books trying to, like I said, sanitize and whitewash their role in the war. And there were authors in the West who sort of picked those stories up and ran with it uncritically, partly because just the nature of the Cold War, which is a whole other topic, and maybe I'll get into that someday. But like I said, anything with the SS histories, or things about the German army and the Eastern Front, always just be very careful to make sure, where's the information coming from? Has it been corroborated with other things? What are the sources these people are using? Sort of learn how these, the techniques of writing history, what the sources are, that kind of thing. It's important, because otherwise you get things that, like I say, you could read this book and come away with the main narrative, which is that this was a very effective division that fought very bravely, and was sort of maligned after the war. Recriminations were made, but it doesn't go into what exactly they were, other than that one little paragraph. And the truth is, I think that we need to be a little more critical than that. So that's my review. And all that aside, and I know that was sort of a long rant, but other than that, like I said, it's a very handsome book. If you need a handy reference, because about this division, it's not bad. It's like I said, it's certainly attractive. Just keep in mind that this is really strictly a military history. It's kind of just I think taking up a lot of what's sort of been out there and condensing it and adding a lot of illustrations and photos. Again, I want to thank the folks at Casemate for sending me this. I always enjoy doing these book reviews. I love looking at books and seeing what's out there. So thanks again. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you liked it, let me know. If you disagree or you think I was off on some terrible tangent that you don't like, let me know. I'm always willing to defend my opinions. And, if you want to defend the N or the SS, I'll take you on that one. So thank you, and we'll catch you on the next one.